We're going to get started with our next presenter. Her name is Brenda Clarkson. She's our first speaker, and she's Executive Director at the Virginia Association for Hospice and Palliative Care, and also the 2015 Vanguard Award winner for HPNA. In the course of Ms. Clarkson's career, she has made numerous professional contributions, which include serving as a founding board member on the Hospice Nurses Association, which is now HPNA. And also, she's a founding board member of and the first president of the National Board for Certification of Hospice Nursing, which is now known as HPCC. So, a long history with both organizations. Brenda has also served as a clinical administrative positions throughout her career and developed and implemented numerous innovative programs and services that have improved the delivery of hospice and palliative care for patients and their families. Recently, Brenda co-authored a book, The Heart of Hospice, the core competencies for reclaiming the mystery, with the intent of preventing the heart of hospice from being lost in the midst of the challenges that face today's healthcare programs. So we are honored and happy to have Brenda as a presenter today. And everyone, please give a warm welcome to Brenda Clarkson.
It's always a pleasure to be in Pittsburgh because I spent the first 12 years of my American life in Pittsburgh, so I love coming home. So, and thank you, Chad, for that introduction. I'm still going to tell you the best introduction I've ever had. When I was a clinical supervisor here in Pittsburgh, if I went out to do supervisory visits, I had a staff nurse who used to introduce me to her patients and families with the best words ever. She would say, "This is Brenda, she's my boss, and she's got 3 claims to fame. She's English, she's the mother of triplets, and she saw the Beatles live." I saw them before they ever came to you guys. So I am delighted to be here, and I am a hospice nurse. I know we're now hospice and palliative care, but I have never been a palliative care nurse. I have always been a hospice nurse. And so you will hear that bias in me as I talk. Could I just get an idea of who you all are? How many of you have been doing hospice and palliative care for less than 5 years? Less than 10 years? Okay, more than 10 years. Woo! There are a lot of moldy oldies in the room. I love them. Thank you. Okay. What I'm going to talk about is the culmination of 50-plus years of hospice nursing with my co-author and myself. And we came up with the notion of writing a book. We had spent so many hours over the years together, over a bottle or 2 of wine, saying what was right and what was wrong, and bitching and moaning, and you know how hospice nurses do. And ultimately, we said, we need to write this down. So we rented a cottage on the Outer Banks in North Carolina, and we wrote about 80% of the book during that 1 week, and then it took us another 18 months to finish the last 20%. So it was a bit of a challenge for us to get it down on paper, but it's really been a blessing to be able to do that and to think through and use words that were more appropriate to be printed than the ones sometimes that we'd use around the table. So one of the real concerns that we have is the changing face of hospice. The changing face of healthcare is one thing, but when it begins to change hospice, then we began to struggle. And we realize that we're in a very challenging environment in hospice care. We are over-regulated. There are so many demands for compliance. Who would ever have thought you could use the words fraud and abuse and hospice in the same sentence? And now when I go out and speak, I am nervous about the questions I'm going to get from the public because they've read the Washington Post and they've read Huffington Post and they know about these things. I get calls every week from the members of the public trying to find the best hospice for their loved one. It's difficult these days to know how to answer that question. This regulatory scrutiny, as you all know, has imposed a layer, an extra layer in hospice that means there's somebody who's been hired or somebody who's not doing clinical work in order to be the compliance officer. The financial constraints that we're all under have led to enormous staff turnover. I don't know what it's like where you live, but when I first went to Richmond, Virginia, I opened the second hospice. Now there's 17. Now, competition is a good thing, or it's not necessarily a bad thing, and that may be a little bit more accurate. But what used to happen is if you were dissatisfied in your job in hospice back when there was 2 employers, you sucked it up and you learned how to deal. Now, you just go on to the next hospice. So it's a struggle to remember the defining principles that hospice was founded on. And I find that more and more people who are entering hospice, they're not being taught some of these things in their orientation. So that in some ways we're losing some of the basic foundation upon which we were based. Hospice in this country was started by people who had survived the 60s. They were the hippies, they were the revolutionaries. They were, when I used to go to NHO meetings, in the beginning, there used to be resolutions from the floor, and there was almost fisticuffs, because people were so passionate about what was going on and changing the face of death in this country. And I do think we have changed the face of death in this country. We really have. Thank you. We've a lot more to do, ladies and gentlemen. There's still a long way to go. We started to look at what did hospice look like in its origin, what does it look like today, and then what would we like it to look like? And we call this the mystery. And we talk about mystery, and I'll go into that in a little bit, but these are the sorts of things that have made a change in how hospices are run and how we learn to do our work. We've got limited resources now, and we used to be the only game in town. Now we have this competitive marketplace. Back in the beginning, and I hope I don't end up doing this all the time, saying back in the day, I don't mean that, because back in the day, we didn't know what we were doing. We didn't. There was nothing on bereavement. We made that up as we went along. And nurses were doing most of the bereavement, squished in between everything else they were doing. If they had time left over, they did bereavement calls. So I think the bereavement part of what we do has improved leaps and bounds. We now do have a body of knowledge about bereavement, and we do have some experts in the field. But back in the day, we were using methadone, and shame on us, because we didn't know all the disasters that can happen with methadone. Anyway, that's for another story. The real dilemma, I think, is that dying has become a medical event. And in a climate in which the only things that have value are the things that can be measured, then of course it's going to be the physical, isn't it? Because you can measure physical stuff. How do you measure transcendence? How do you measure the growth in a family that comes together finally around the death of a mother or a father? You can't measure that in a way that can go on Hospice Compare. And so those sorts of things, it seems to me, are losing, are not being valued. And that's the real crux of what's going on. So, the mystery of death. We have to get back to understanding the mystery of death and what we mean by the mystery of death. What we mean is the whole thing that encompasses death and dying, the whole unknowable, ineffable, unmeasurable peace that goes on when you're with a patient who is dying and when you're with those family members. It's the reconciliation of body, mind, and spirit at end of life. It's attempting to build a bridge between the clinical and the rest, the mystery. It's difficult to put into words, which is why the book is not very long. No, that's not true. So it's honoring the uniqueness of each person. It's valuing that essence for which we grieve when a person dies. It's acknowledging the interdependent web of which we're all part. It's the mystery. I want to read to you a quote that we have in the book from Dr. Rachel Naomi Raymond, who is a medical director in California. And she says, "Care of the dying presents a bit of a quandary for those trained in the skills of physical medicine because its focus is care of the soul, not just the body." She goes on to say, "The dying are not broken, and everything we cannot understand may not be awry." And I love that. We decided to try to come up with a mystery model of death and dying, and we chose this shell as a symbol. And we chose it because it's natural, we chose it because it's beautiful, we chose it because it's a spiral. We really wanted something that looks more like a DNA helix, and we couldn't quite do that, so we came up with the shell. It's a spiral of learning. The segments, they overlap, and who knows, there might be some pearls of wisdom inside that shell. So you all know what a competency is. You struggle over those every time you have your performance appraisal. It's the things that they can measure, the things that demonstrate to the powers that be that you've got the knowledge and the skills and the practical application of something that you've learned. And that's not what we're talking about. The reason that we chose the title for the book, The Heart of Hospice, Core Competencies for Reclaiming the Mystery, was that we hoped we would get both the left brain people and the right brain people. Because if we just called it The Heart of Hospice or The Mystery of Hospice or something, all the left brainers, they'd have left it behind. So what we're trying to do here is talk about the core competencies that have to be experienced. We can teach, we can model, we can do everything we can to help our teammates understand, but until you experience some of these core competencies, whilst you're with the dying patient and whilst you're with the family and whilst you're witnessing and being a presence, until you do all of those things, they're difficult to grasp onto. And this is, again, another place where I think it's difficult to measure these sorts of competencies. Some of these words up here, you've seen the words before, but we're talking about the competencies that pertain specifically to that continual exposure to death. So comforting, for example. There's nothing in this book about pain management and shortness of breath and all of that. If you want that, there are lots of other books. Comforting has a different meaning for us as we look at the mystery. We started out with some research that was done published in 1995. Any of you heard of a nurse called Joyce Zerwick? And this makes me sad every time I ask the question, because you're not alone. Most people have not heard of her either. She did some phenomenal research back in the 90s. She asked expert hospice nurses to tell her their stories. Now, what a wonderful concept is that? Just tell me about what you do. And from those stories, she extrapolated some competencies. And she came up with them, and we, Myra, my co-author, and I, started to incorporate those into nurse orientation in a hospice we were working in Chicago. And we, over the years, have built on those and added to them. But this is wonderful research that she did, and I really am grateful for everything that Joyce taught us. Right at the middle is sustaining self. Sustaining the self is the taproot of hospice care. If you are not looking after yourself, shame on you. And if you work for an organization that does not value looking after yourself, shame on them. And that's one of the big rubs, isn't it? I have been that administrator who has said to a nurse or a social worker or a chaplain, you know, you really need to take care of yourself. This is tough work we're doing. Oh, and can you do an extra on-call on Saturday? I've done it. I know I have. But it doesn't make it right. So deliberate self-care is indeed the taproot of hospice care. You have to develop some self-care techniques that are congruent with your beliefs and the way you live your life. I mean, I cannot do the Om thing, the meditation. My son teaches meditation, and he's tried his best with me. I just can't do that. But I've got some other stuff that I do. And so we have to find something that turns the small self into the self with the capital S, so that we're really looking after ourselves and our soul. We have to have healthy self-esteem. And by that, I mean we have to look at the world, the hospice world, through our own eyes, not just what they tell you, whoever the they is, the they of the day. We have to create experiences that challenge us to take care of our souls as well as our bodies. We have to learn to receive. Nurses are really good at giving, not so good at receiving. And the wisdom that is around the mystery of death, those of you who've been around long enough, you know this. It's phenomenal. And we have to learn how to receive that as well as to be able to give. If we don't receive that wisdom, we're not going to be whole enough to go on to the next person and give. Every patient deserves 100% of me when I'm seeing patients. I can't leave part of me behind in the last home visit. I've got to be all together to go on to the next. I'm not going to talk about boundaries because everybody talks about boundaries, and they're a little difficult, aren't they? But we do have to learn how to create a container for our own self that allows us to be whole and sustained and resilient, whilst also letting all the rest in as and when we need to. I think one of the most important things about self-care is reflective practice. And we have a tool in the book that goes through the 9 steps of being able to do this. And this is something I've learned from social workers. You know, the social workers do what they call supervision. And that essentially means sitting down with a licensed clinical social worker to go over your caseload, to go over your visits, to go over your transactions, and find out what went well and what didn't go well. And so reflective practice is really, really important. And nurses we don't do that. Do any of you guys have that set up? We really could. I think this may be something for a chapter to work on, to start developing a way to do reflective practice even at your chapter meetings. I would love to get to a situation where we have concurrent charting. So you do your chart, for your EMR and all that stuff that's going to get you paid. But then when you get into the car or you get wherever you need to be, you write down what really happened. What really happened around the mystery of death and dying. What really happened about your feelings and your spiritual intuition, whatever it is that gets you about that visit. It doesn't have to be more than a couple of sentences. And then you've got something that you can reflect on, you can go over with somebody else. I think it's really, really important that we take a look at doing a better job of self-sustaining. I mean, we talk about exercise and diet and all of that stuff, and that's fine. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about really looking after ourselves. Connecting is another important competency, particularly at end of life. It's absolutely central to all human beings, isn't it, that we make connections. I went to watch the Pirates last night, and oh, what a boring game that was. We left early. But I went with two friends of mine, one of whom is a hospice social worker. And I'm telling you, before I was seated in my seat, she's already connecting with people all around her. Some people do that intuitively. And maybe all of us can do it intuitively when the cards are right. But what we have to learn how to do is to connect with everybody and anybody, even when there's changes, there's differences in belief systems between us. There's differences in culture between us. We have to become intentional in the way we connect. And you can only do that if you've prepared yourself ahead of time. How many of you have little rituals that you do before and or after a visit? Yeah, I found this, it doesn't have to be complicated. When you turn off the ignition and you're ready to go into the house, just 3 deep breaths will do it. Just center yourself. And the same thing when you get out. Get back in the car, and before you turn it on again, something like that, to just take care of yourself and demark yourself from that visit to the next visit. You have to be ready to connect. And it's your job to connect. It's not up to the patient and family to connect with you. It's your job to do that, regardless, as I say, of the differences that you may have with the patients and the families. Stories are so important in connecting. You can do a life history. You can do a life review and get people to tell their stories. And you don't just get what you need for your assessment, but you get what connects people together. And that is a great way. And you're probably going to tell me, Brenda, we don't have time to do all of this. And I understand back in my day as a hospice staff nurse here in Pittsburgh, the average number of visits that I had to make was 2.8 per day. Easy for me, right? So I know that you are up against a lot of constraints now with timing and so on and so forth. But the number one thing is intention. That should be on the visor of your car. Pull it down and take a look at that before you step out of the car. It's your intention to do all of the things that we're going to talk about today. So it's just vital that we learn more about stories. Stories hold us together, don't they? I mean, think about your family and the stories. We all have probably been through the same events and been exposed to the same facts, but our stories about those will be very different. And those are the things that we need to collect. We need to be connected to our patients and families. We need to be connected to our teams. That's another thing that's happening in hospice these days, isn't it? The team is going away. And by that, I mean team meeting. It's not the same anymore. You're so busy reviewing the plan of care and getting this check and that check and the other check. And it has to be done under the regulations that we're under. I'm not decrying that. What I'm decrying is the regulations that put you there. It's really, I learned more on how to be a good hospice nurse from the people who sat around the team table, the chaplain, the social. I learned so much from social workers. I was a fairly mature nurse when I started doing hospice care, and didn't have a lot of time for social workers, to be honest, until I met hospice social workers. They're brilliant, and they have so much to teach. But I learned so much from that table, that meeting where we would talk about our patients and families. We connect best when we're in a nurturing space, and that's one of the jobs that we have to do when we're doing a patient visit, but that's also what we have to do in team. It has to feel safe to be talking to your co-workers, and it doesn't always, does it? We have to work on that, I think. And nurses are usually the majority. It's up to us to fix this. And we're good at fixing stuff. So it's up to us, I think, to make some changes to allow the chaplain and the social worker and the aide, for goodness sake, what wisdoms they carry around. And lots of hospices don't even have their aides at team meeting anymore. I don't know how you can find out all the juicy stuff if you don't have the aides there, because they know it all. Okay. Connecting in this sort of way really changes your clinical practice to a spiritual practice. And that's the essence of the mystery. Abraham Lincoln said, first, something like, I can't remember it exactly, but first decide where to put your feet and then stand firm. And I love that. We do this a lot, standing by and standing firm. Standing by is like witnessing what's going on, being a presence, and standing firm is that which you do when you are in the eye of the storm. And I'm sure you've all been there. Do you remember that first time that angry patient or that angry family member just vomited all over you? And how guilty you felt and how terrible you felt and how it was all your fault and all that stuff. I remember it. And you have to learn how to be able to stand firm without taking that on. And we have in the book a really good story that my co-author tells about watching an irate son just explode. And we've all been there. We've all been there. We have to be the eye of the storm sometimes. We have to be able to stand firm in the face of suffering. We have to be able to understand that pain management and suffering are not the same thing. We have to stand firm when we're witnessing families do their family stuff. I was at meetings at NHPCO this week, and Don Schumacher, the president of NHPCO, said the last functional family died in 1995. I don't know if he got the date right, but I understand his meaning. So we have to stand firm when people are making choices. There's so many choices that patients and families have to have to make. There's choices when the pains are being endured, when suffering is being endured, when hopes appear to be lost. We're the ones who stand firm and stand by and witness and give some hope. Just our presence can give hope that the patient and the family can deal with what's going on, just by our presence. So we make a safe, secure place for at least the exploration of all these mysterious things and hopefully the resolution of some of the questions. Oprah said, that great philosopher Oprah said, "I see you, I hear you, and what you say matters to me." That's another thing. Put that on your visor. I think that's really good too. If we can allow our patients and families to hear that, I see you, I hear you, and what you say matters to me, I think that would be a wonderful thing. We can only stand by and stand firm effectively if our egos are out of the way and if our agenda is out of the way. And I don't know about you, but it took me a long time to get my agenda out of the way. I still don't always do it well with my kids, but it's something that we have to be mindful of, and we have to get it out. And we have to become a calm witness to what's going on. We have to, what do they say nowadays, hold the space for this family mystery to play out. And it may not play out in the way that we had hoped. Cicely Saunders, does that name ring a bell? Okay, good. Cicely Saunders created a couple of really wise things, I think. She talked about total pain and therefore the team approach to end-of-life care. But she also talked about a good enough death. Good enough. And we have to be okay with a good enough death. Not a good death. Hopefully we'll get some of those too, but good enough is good enough. If it's good enough for the patient and it's good enough for the family. May not be exactly what we had planned, but it's good enough. Oh, okay. I think we get that, Brenda. Okay. I'm going to ask you another question from way back, and that is, how many of you have heard of Bernice Harper? Okay. Bernice Harper is a social worker. She is a very regal black woman. If ever you go to hospice meetings and there's a woman draped in kente cloth and she has a big beehive hairdo, that will be Bernice Harper. She is magnificent. And she wrote a book that I think is still in print. It's called Death, Coping Mechanisms for Healthcare Workers, or something like that. We've got a reference to it in the back of our book. She looked at social workers who were in positions where death was common, and she described the phases that people go through to become what good social worker language she calls self-actualized as a hospice worker. For the nurses, that means okay with doing the job. And she did it, in phases, and of course, unfortunately, we don't teach it anymore. And this is something that I feel really, really strongly about, this way of developing. People probably ask you, why did you start doing this hospice work, with a really pained look on their face? And I always used to say it was because I was professionally embarrassed at the way people were dying in acute care in England, where I was working at the time. And that was the truth. But it wasn't until I'd got into hospice and had been through a lot that I realized that was only partly the truth. The real reason I was in hospice was for my own spiritual development. And we develop as hospice workers, given the chance, we develop. We don't develop, I think, in the way Bernice told us, in phases and stages. You know, we ruined the work of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross by saying, you do this, and then you do this, and then you do this. It's not like that. You can go up and down and back and forth, and so we call it the mystery path, and we have reduced Bernice Harper's original work to just the 4 stages because this is simpler. And we've taken words that hopefully reflect the art of hospice care, not simply the science of hospice care. So the novice, this is the person who comes to hospice, has been a nurse for many years often, and comes to hospice for whatever reason, and they bring their skills and their knowledge with them. But the core competencies that we are talking about that we believe are the essence of hospice nursing, I said earlier, they are developed in the presence of continual grief and continual death. And so they're really novices. They're real novices, even if they've been nursing for 10, 15 years. And we have to bring them into the fold. The novices tend to be, well, think back to when you were a novice hospice nurse. You were really anxious to please. You were happy to be there. You wanted to learn everything. You were so flummoxed by the equi-analgesic dosing thingies, and you needed to know about how to get a physician in the middle of the night. There was so much going on in your head. You were learning so much that the emotional impact of death and dying was probably way behind you. You didn't even notice it. You're so busy with the EMR and all of that stuff. So the novice concentrates on tangible services. We have this great advantage in this phase, us nurses, because if we get the bowels going, we're a friend for life, right? So the tangible stuff really works. This is the honeymoon phase of an employee. Think about somebody who is on your team right now who is a novice. Think about how you can help them retain their beginner's mind as they begin to learn more and more about the mystery of death and dying. But don't expect them to know much about that at this point because they're too busy up in their head to have made the heart connection yet. The apprentice is somebody who moves on from the novice phase, clearly. They get an increased knowledge base, but they actually don't get any more comfortable in their work. They are frustrated. They're guilty about their robust health. This is the phase when living in Pittsburgh, my husband said to me one night, if you come home from work with another brain tumor, you're going to have to get another job. You know, we over-identify. We're feeling bad because everybody around us is dying and we're good. And so, you know, it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable. What Bernice Harper calls in good social worker language, we have a traumatized state of awareness due to the sheer numbers of deaths. We begin to be willing to take a look at some of the emotional things that are going around us, but it's so painful for us that we don't like it, and we stuff it. And then one day, we go out to do an admission, and there in this little bed is this little old lady who looks just like your grandma, or the young man who looks just like your brother, and you lose it. You remember doing that? You lose it, hopefully not in the home. You get back in the car, and you lose it. And what happens under those circumstances is that little person who look just like your grandma triggers all that cumulative grief that you've been stuffing away for the past 6 months or a year or however long it takes you to get to this stage. And the floodgates open. And hopefully you have a good hospice team around you who can help you with that. But this is a very common occurrence in a hospice nurse. It's what I call the grow or go phase. You get to the point where you think to yourself, can I keep doing this? Is this what I really want to do? Has anybody in this room not asked themselves that question at some point? No, we all do. And whatever answer comes out of that question, it's a very honorable answer. The only dishonorable thing is not to ask the question. What we have to do, those of us in the room who are supervisors and managers, we have to allow that person to move on with dignity if that is the right thing to do. Because the rest of us don't want that person in our team. We want somebody who wants to be here, don't we? We have to have people who want to be here. So this grow or go phase, it actually requires a great deal of courage to move on to the next phase, because you know that you're going to be exposed to so much more suffering, so much more grieving, all of those things. So then you move on to the artisan phase. This is where you have a renewed commitment to what you have decided. You've decided to stay, so the renewed commitment is there. On most days, good days, it's there. And other days you have friends around you who can help you, hopefully. So you're beginning to develop some resilience. You're beginning to develop, hopefully, some ways of being that get you through the bad visits, that help you with the tough family members. Usually, I remember often saying that when I was a hospice clinical manager, I love this hospice work. If it wasn't for the families and the staff, it would be great. So you need people around you who can get you over those days. So you begin to have intentional responses. I used to be a Joint Commission surveyor back in the day when we had real standards, hospice standards for Joint Commission. And I can remember going on the home visits and asking the nurse, what's your goal for this visit? And you could tell from the glazed look that, goal? What are you talking about? We have to be intentional about what we're doing. We can't just show up because this is the third visit that we've got approval for the week or whatever it is. There's got to be a goal. We've got to be doing things intentionally. We've got to have the emotional intelligence to monitor ourselves in relationship to the patients and their families. We've got to do that in order to be fully present for everybody. And then that's hard to do, particularly when there's discord. But that's the beauty of a team. There's very few hospices these days that do joint visits. Do you do joint visits? Good, because I think a joint admission visit is the best thing that was ever invented. Going out with a social worker and a nurse to do the admission, it sets up the plan of care in a way that you can't ever do when you do that separately. Humble opinion, that's what I believe. So you begin to have a reflective practice. You begin to be more free in the sense that you begin to listen to your intuition, not just listen to it, but actually honor it and own up to the fact that some of the things you're doing intuitively. Intuition is a good thing. Because it's typically a female trait, it's been devalued, but it's a good thing. I'm not saying you don't need knowledge. Yes, you do, but you need to listen to your intuition also. So you become less rule-bound. This is where you bend the rules a little bit, and you learn how to do that with dignity and without documentation. And you learn how to be effective even though you're sad. That old question, how do you do that work? It must be so depressing. And you all know, it's not depressing, but it is sad sometimes, isn't it? And you have to learn, we all have to learn how to be effective while being sad, and how to give that next patient 100% when we're creaking a little bit inside. So the Artisan moves on to being, this was a real tough name for us to come up with, because we didn't want to be experts. So we took a riff on the SME, the subject matter expert, and we called it a sage, a master, an elder. A sage is somebody who's wise, who's prudent, who has good judgment. A master, we believe, is somebody with meticulous clinical skills. And that's something that Dame Cicely Saunders said, that at the basis of hospice care is meticulous nursing. Remember that adjective, meticulous. We can all do that on a good day. And you're not only a meticulous clinician, but you also learn how to transmit your knowledge in ways that don't sound too preachy to people. You learn to be a thoughtful leader. You learn how to be resilient. To be an elder, you have the authority that comes from experience. You become the go-to person. Many of you probably are the go-to person in your hospices. If anybody showing leadership in HPNA, I think, is probably a go-to person back home. So they're the ones where people come and ask you how to and what next. And enjoy that role, because that's the feeling of coming home to what we're doing. And that's a really good feeling, to feel at home in nursing. I felt, as some of you may have done, that once I found hospice nursing, I found what I was taught to be back in school. It was real, and I felt as though I'd come home to that. So you learn how to give fully of yourself, at the same time retaining your integrity, your spiritual, your emotional integrity. You have the ability to transform knowledge into wisdom. You have the ability to inspire the newbies, and it's just a great place to be. And I said this several times, on a good day, because it is like this. We don't have continual, consecutive good days, I know that. But if you are in this phase, you bounce back much more easily. You're resilient. You can go on. You have deep compassion, not just for the patients and families, but the team members. And you have the deepest compassion for yourself. You become peaceful with the unanswerable questions. I was just reading on my iPhone before we started a meditation that said something about, you learn best when you go down, not when you're on the up. So takes wisdom to know that. By making the mistakes, we learn from those and we move on. We use our whole being. We're the best advocates for hospice that ever were when we get to this stage. And we use ourself in a very soulful way. We're respectful of others. We're respectful of ourselves, and we're respectful of our team. So, if we're to do all this great stuff, we need to be supported by employers. We need to have a mystery model organization around us, and this is less and less clear to me that we all have this. So the workplace values have to support honoring self-care as a retention strategy. It costs upwards of $40,000 to hire and orient a new person. If we would just look after each other so that people didn't leave, we could save a lot of money. So people have to understand that. We have to integrate these core competencies into orientation, and we have to teach the managers also, not just the people in the field. We have to teach managers how to develop a mystery model workplace. And we've come up with a few tools that we use. The first one of the tools that we've used in the book is a mystery path self-care plan. And we based it on the work of Joan Halifax. Joan Halifax is a Buddhist monk who works with the dying. And I love this phrase she has, that keeping your personal life together is not an optional indulgence, but an absolute necessity. And so we've got this little plan in the book that you can write down, what you want to do and take care of yourself. It is true, if you do write this stuff down, you're much more likely to carry it out. We're actually working on an app to see if we could put this on your phone so it could remind you to breathe and all of those things. We have this self-assessment worksheet, and essentially it's all the competencies and the phases and stages that you go through, and you self-assess, because you can be a novice in one area and an expert in another. And you take a look at that and you sit down with somebody who's trusted, not your clinical supervisor. I don't mean your clinical supervisor is somebody you can't trust. I didn't mean that. What I mean was somebody who is not your clinical supervisor, who's not responsible for your performance appraisal, somebody who you can be really honest with and feel comfortable with. And you go over this and you talk about what you need to do to get to the next phase on this, on these competencies. That's the slide that should have come up first. So the other thing is this reflective clinical practice that I talked about, and we have a supervision sheet for that that will be helpful. So there we are. That's what we mean by the Heart of Hospice, and that's what we mean about reclaiming the mystery. And anybody who wants these tools, if you email me, I can send you electronic versions of them. Anybody who, can I say that I have books? Please. Okay. I do have some books. But I would like to ask if anybody has questions or if anybody has some validation of what's going on with them around some of these issues. I think one of the things that I didn't say that I would like to say is the path that we go through. It's important not just for you to know where you are, but it's important for you to recognize where your colleagues are, because your approach to being supportive of a novice ought to be different than your approach to being supportive of an artisan. So it's not just yourself, but it's the team. I don't know where we are for time, Chad, but anybody got a question or a comment or a story they could share?
So my name is Nargis Nardi. I'm from Rainbow Hospice in Mount Prospect, Illinois, and I think what struck me, and I wrote her name down, is a new grad that I fought to hire last year. And she was the top of her nursing class, and I saw so much potential in her as an individual, as a nurse, and specifically a hospice nurse. And she was promised a 6-month orientation. So as the clinical education manager, which is a team of 1, I didn't have a large voice in that, and thus when there was a large need to have more clinicians, we kind of threw her after 8 weeks. So she resigned 3 weeks ago, and on her exit interview, she brought that up, that she was told she would have been supported. And I see that, she probably was an apprentice, but we didn't support her enough. We didn't validate what she was feeling. We weren't there for her.
Right.
And now she left. She didn't have another job. It's not like she left to go to another hospice. She left because she had, I think, moral injury, because
Yes.
she was told she had to do these visits, she had to do everything, and she got so focused on the tasks instead of the giving of herself. So that really struck me.
The giving of herself and the receiving of the wisdom. Yeah, absolutely. And I think I just did a survey of hospices in Virginia about, do you hire new grads? Because with the crunch for staff, we always used to say, no, you've got to have 2 years. But people are beginning to hire new grads, particularly those that have had hospice experience as an LPN or an aide or something like that. And a couple of them did say they had a special orientation. And the word special wasn't defined. But I do think we have to get away from this habit that nurses have of eating their young. We have to give these people the support they need to get to the good spot, because getting to the good spot in your development, it's hard and it's not instantaneous. It takes time. You have to have been around the mystery of death quite a bit before you really, really get it. When I worked with my first hospice here in Pittsburgh, I can remember going back to my boss at one point and saying, you know, nobody talks about dying to their patients and families, because I was doing visits with people who were already working. And then it dawned on me years later that the hospice was less than a year old. It was 1980. The hospice had only been operating a year, so nobody had a clue what they were doing. So they were all in that novice phase of being up in the head. They hadn't learned yet how to open their hearts. So there was very little talk about death and dying. There was lots of talk about pain and symptom management, and we were really good at that, but we were afraid of the rest of it. And it sounds as though your new grad was ready for that, and she was let down. Yeah.
So Brenda, I'm encouraged by what you're saying, because being in hospice for 26 years, we were nursing-led, we were team-focused 26 years ago. And then as I saw us build care centers and inpatient units, and we had more providers in those facilities, we became very much the medical model that you talked about. And we're saying in our organization now, how do we get away from that? And this is the answer. And my heart is full.
Good. Good. Thank you.
I have a plan. I want books.
In reflecting back to what you said about your new grad, I'm blessed to have a very seasoned hospice team. Some of them have been with this team since hospice started where we are in 1995. And so when we orient our new hospice nurses, we give them a 12-week orientation. However, I think in moving to that maybe apprentice stage, or where they have to recommit, the team has gotten very good. In our agency, we call it the wall. It's like at about 6, 7, sometimes a little sooner, a little later, it's like, they're hitting the wall.
Right.
And so the team has been really good about coming together and taking that person under their wing and kind of helping them get through it, because it's a hard thing.
It is hard.
Yeah.
It is. Good. I'm glad you're doing that.
Hi, I'm Amy. I wanted to say thank you for being honest and true and sharing your heart with us.
Thank you.
And I want to say thank you to HPNA for bringing you to us. I think as an organization striving to promote excellence in education and skill, the focus is not always on this, and that's just for our whole specialty. And that I've been a member and attending since 2010. So as that novice coming in and going to like the annual assembly, I was just looking everywhere for this connection. And I might get it at the annual assembly when I went to the remembrance ceremony, but I was just kind of like looking around for this thing that I connected to in my daily work, and not finding it at the annual assembly. I would love to have this message to have you be in the annual assembly, speaking to the entire crowd, because this is the heart of who we are, and this is what we have to focus on to continue and spread. And thank you.
Thank you. The first conference that we had with HNA back in the day, we had it in June in Arizona because it was the only hotel we could afford. You know, who the heck wants to be there? It was something like 110 degrees. And we had 40 people, and that was success, 40 people. So we've come a long way, baby. Yes.
No, I echo everything that everyone's been saying. I've been in palliative care, not hospice, but palliative care for a long time too, about almost 20 years. But I think what I really was really amazed at is that you put in words what I've kind of thought about but couldn't really put it together. And what you've done, it is so clear. And I do think that I'm I don't know if I'm a sage. I always thought that as sort of an old kind of person. I try not to be too old, but I do feel pretty experienced. I think of sage rolling along on the desert, but I do think that I'll be able to use and take a lot of what you've done to help my team, and I'm very grateful for that and very excited that you've really well done, put it together so I can use it. And we've been talking in this group about how to help and support our team and our other members of the chapters and new people, and a lot of us are trying to think how, and we could take this, and I think HPNA could really use this to help us to grow people.
I think the chapters could be a place where this prospers, because you may not get all employers on board, but
Right.
the chapters could do this.
Oh, I think so. I think, and the value that you have for each other, and that's why the chapters kind of exist. We were talking about that, is that collegiality and to help each other.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Nancy Romanchuk from Journey Care in Chicagoland chapter, and I share the sentiment that you have been able to put into words what I could not. My background is I'm a parish nurse, so I do have one foot in the spiritual realm, and I'm very aware of that. And I overlap a lot of the things that I attend with chaplains. I actually have a partnership with the Lutheran School of Theology to teach chaplains the needs of Muslim patients, which is a huge absent area. So I have a lot of connections with chaplains. Last week I attended a chaplaincy program out of Northwest Community where they have like $1 million grant to do research on chaplaincy, and they have not been able to have data to support how important they are, so they tend to be diminished in their role. Parish nurses have a different aspect of spirituality towards our patient care, and I was very interested in the way that you presented it, and your seashell is beautiful because it captures so many really important things that as we move to business models are being dropped, and I feel it in my soul when I go to work these days. But my question to you has to do with, early in your conversation, you spoke about a hospice in Chicago where you were integrating these core into your orientation. How is it going?
Well, I am no longer with that hospice in Chicago, so it didn't have a very long life because I don't think it was continued after I left.
Because this is a really important thing as I make that connection with what the chaplains are experiencing, to put this in place and to show with research and data that it is valuable, it is useful. Because this is the piece that nurses have historically established a place, and then the doctors step in and take it over. This is the reason. Because we never establish ourselves through data saying, no, it must be this way and it must be nurses. Because the doctors, through the years, the nurses would go out in the trenches, and then the doctors would say, I did a home visit. What a great idea.
Yeah.
And we're like, you know what I mean? And that's why, because we don't get it pen to paper, and we don't prove our worth.
It's true. I do think some of these are not very amenable to measurement. So if you ever come up with some ways of measuring, give me a call, because I would love to be part of that.
Well, that's what the chaplains are grappling with. Exactly what you said. How do you measure transcendence?
Right.
How do you measure that this visit made a difference?
Well, if you look at the quality measures that CMS is putting out for hospice, they think they've added on a spiritual measure, and that is, did you do a spiritual assessment? Whoop-de-doo.
Hi, is it on? Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Edith O'Neill Page, and I'm palliative care nurse at UCLA. Although I started out, my first experience was with home care, which was really palliative and also hospice and the same thing all rolled together, because it was before the Medicare hospice benefit.
Right.
And so basically, I worked for City of Hope, so it was absolutely palliative and hospice all rolled into one bundle. And this touched me so deeply that I think this is why I've done it for all of these years. I've always been involved with, is it dying? Anyway, it has really meant a lot to me, and I want to thank you again for bringing all of this. And I see it taking a lot of this back to our chapter, which is in desperate need of some spiritual connection to what they do every day with short of money. I also have to say that at UCLA, which is a huge center, I have a department of one, and they just saw fit to give me an FTE in as a social worker, and she starts next week, and she was given 1 week of orientation with social work at UCLA, and I asked for a 1 week orientation to the unit to work with me as a cohort, and it was denied. So I had a half day on Thursday, but next week she has to be ready to roll. And she's brand new out of social work, so I'm going to take some of this to her and think, I'm not going to put a Band-Aid on it. I think I need a whole intervention, and I'm going to have to develop a plan. But so thank you. You've given me some wonderful tools.
Thank you. Thank you all very much. We got another question? Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. We really appreciate you coming out today. So
Thank
thank you.
you.